for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest is Alex Bovee. Alex, if you want to give a little background on yourself and the company to kick things off, that would be cool.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Tony, for having me. I really appreciate the time today. Yeah, so my background is in security. I've lived and breathed security for a very long time, over 15 years, working first in mobile security, and then previously at Okta, where I led up security and zero trust products there, focused mostly on authentication and device-aware access control. And really started ConductorOne to help solve some problems that we saw as it related to getting access to users at the right time with the right level of permissions, sort of managing authorization around your employee and your workforce users. And happy to get into that more, but we've been at ConductorOne for a little over 2 years. We're a venture-backed startup, great customers, really focused on sort of that IGA and modern cloud PAM space.
Okay. So I guess one place I'd like to sort of start things, and you and I have talked about this a little bit when we spoke in the past, is just I think that it's an interesting story to tell, to say, you were at Okta and you saw this problem and you're solving the problem, and because Okta, to many people, Okta is also trying to solve that problem. So, what is it that's unique about your approach, unique about ConductorOne? Like, what made you say, you know what, I need to go start this other thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it all started, first I'll start with the problem statement, and then I'll talk a little bit about why we thought there was an interesting opportunity to solve it in a unique and different way. So the problem statement that we saw, I was at Okta, I was leading zero trust and security products. And what that really meant at the end of the day was a big focus on authentication. How do you authenticate users and how do you authenticate devices? And I was the biggest proponent of multi-factor authentication you'd ever meet. That was like what my security roadmap was centered around. It was FIDO, it was hard tokens, it was push notifications and verifications and OTPs and the sort of smorgasbord of credentials that you could imagine for every sort of different form factor and deployability concern that you might have for an organization. And that's great. I think that really solves a significant security problem as it relates to making sure that the user who is saying that they are a certain identity is actually that identity and is actually that person. That's the authentication problem. The problem that I saw every customer struggling with was really around authorization management. It was about how do you there's this proliferation of groups within your organization. No one knows what all the different groups do and the access that it gains. You have tons of SaaS applications, and this run to the cloud has been great for productivity because people have adopted tons of SaaS, but then you've got this massive SaaS sprawl, and how do you secure it? You've got all of your production infrastructure and data and customer data effectively in the cloud, many times administered and managed by different teams or application owners throughout the organization. And so this problem of the sprawl of identities and the access that they have, and making sure that you get the right amount of access to the right people for the right time to do their job, is really where I saw companies struggling after they felt like they'd solved that authentication problem. And that's the authorization management piece. For me, that was the next step in the least privileged access journey. So I was very focused on zero trust. At Okta, zero trust is about getting strongly authenticating users, encrypting all traffic, and making sure people get the right amount of access for the right amount of time. That last problem is actually nefariously complicated because it's workflow, it's context, it's multi-user decision points, it's kind of automated provisioning and deprovisioning. And without the right product tools to be able to solve those problems, you just end up with over-provisioned users. You end up with people who have too much access. You've pushed too much access to birthright provisioning. And that, at the end of the day, is a security risk. There's no reason that your engineering team should have access to the production infrastructure while they're asleep, right? But if the getting access is really painful, people tend to over-provision. So there's a lot wrapped up sort of in those problem statements. Yeah. The opportunity that we saw to tie it to why what was different was really two fundamental things. One is that we saw this big shift in terms of how companies, particularly modern companies, wanted to manage access. And it was the shift away from sort of command and control, everything through ticketing systems, mostly sort of like driven by IT help desk, much more to a decentralized administration of access where you've got resource owners, application owners, you've got the security team creating policies that kind of define how people should get access and enforcing that. And that's really essential because you really need to kind of break that bottleneck of this central sort of command and control, everything funneling through a single pipeline. It takes you a week to get access. It's really inefficient. No one really has the context of whether you should have it, yes or no. And so that was one big shift that we saw. The other big shift was companies were just clamoring to be able to connect to and leverage that central access control authorization management control plane to any application and technology. And the challenge with that is, as you know, there's literally like thousands of SaaS applications. One of our customers the other day said there's a SaaS for that, kind of meaning like for every single pain point you might have, any sort of like niche problem you might have, there's a SaaS application for that. And so being able to connect up, provision, deprovision, inspect users, understand authorization within the context of those different systems, SaaS infrastructure and on-prem, is a really hard technical problem. And so we've really focused on how we solve that problem at scale as well. Happy to talk more about that.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I think this issue has existed since there have been permissions, but it is the idea of, it's easy to address the squeaky wheel. It's easy, I've been in the network admin shoes or whatever. So people come in and say, I need access to this. It's really easy for me to like click a switch and boom, you have access. But going to, your point about the sprawl, the more challenging part, or the part that isn't enough of a pain point for a lot of organizations to make it a priority, is the life cycle of that. It's okay, but when do they not need access? When should I deprovision that access? And that's how you end up with the sprawl. It's real easy for me to give you access. It's unlikely that I'm going to come back and say, hey, Alex, do you still need that access? And that's, and then you end up with, zombie accounts and zombie devices and things that just have no business being on the network or having access to things that just still do because no one stopped to ask, should they?
That's right. The fundamental challenge actually, and I think this is like a way of thinking about it from a security perspective, is in security, you have to think a lot about sort of the asymmetry of the attack. Is the defense of the attack less costly than the cost for the attacker to actually execute it? And if you get that switch, in other words, if the defense of the attack is more expensive than the attack itself, you have a big problem, because attackers can spend very little calories to, try to execute some sort of attack against you. I think it's a similar problem when it comes to access management and granting. If getting access to people is very expensive, meaning it's help desk tickets, it's manual processes, it's manual workflows, pinging people, it takes tons of time, then necessarily everyone will be very reluctant to like claw that access back or to give it up. And so you end up with these situations where, if you've worked in bigger companies, you've probably seen this. You get a new person joining the team, and it's like, well, what access do they need? And it's like, well, copy everything from Joe. So like, no one actually knows if that's all the access that someone needs, but Joe's been here 15 years and he's accumulated everything. And like, we're just going to copy paste that over to the new employee. And then you're very reluctant to pull that back. So I think part of the challenge in this space in particular is making it extremely low calorie and low touch to remove it, which means automating as much as possible, making it very easy to get it back, which also means automating it as much as possible, and then putting a lot of controls in place, frankly, that just make it kind of super simple to execute, good reasons to remove access or to grant permissions in the first place, like being able to grant access based on a team membership or just in time because you're trying to access production infrastructure, removing access because you haven't used it in 30 days. Those are kind of the controls that we think about that really help people to right-size privileges within their organization over time.
Okay, so thank you. A couple of different things there. Now, hopefully, I'll remember to get to them all. But number one is you mentioned earlier, kind of your, coming from the background of zero trust, and and I've talked in the past about, I've talked extensively about zero trust, but I've talked in the past about zero trust, in my opinion, really just being an evolution or a maturity of the concept of least privileged access. It's just, we're kind of iterating along the way, going, okay, but how can we improve that? But at its core, the goal is the same. The goal is to say, yes, I want you to, I want Alex to have access to all the things he needs to have access to be effective and do his job, but no more. Because when the threat actor compromises your credentials through a phishing attack and they log in as Alex, I want to limit that blast radius. I want to say, okay, you can only get to the things Alex can get to. I don't need Alex to have permission for the finance domain controller.
Yeah, that's right. I 100% agree with you. And I think what a lot of companies are realizing right now is that multi-factor authentication is not enough. So the attackers, they adjust, they get smart, they figure things out. So even if you're doing multi-factor, are using weak credentials, kind of like to your point, are using phishable credentials that someone can replay. Even if that's not the case, we've seen a lot of attacks happen recently where you just hijack the session token. And it's like, well, you can have the best device-aware posture check at the point of authentication, or you're strongly authenticating the credentials of the user. But if the way that those users are being authorized downstream in the systems is with a bearer token that's sitting on their machine, you just have to compromise that token, and it kind of doesn't matter. And then at that point, to your point, that really is the blast radius of the single sign-on in the access that a user has is the blast radius of what that attacker is allowed to leverage at that point and what resources and data that they have access to. And so I 100% agree with you. I think the kind of step one, we think of definitely there's like a maturity curve as it relates to zero trust. Step one, tie your shoes, strongly authenticate your users. I think, frankly, least privilege and zero standing privilege is like a little bit harder in my mind because it's less like a single point in time. It's more about all the different systems and technologies you have, being able to get visibility into them and being able to kind of right-size those permissions and privileges as close to real time as possible, to your point.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you mentioned was, the idea of, have you used these, have these credentials been used in the last 30 days or whatever, which does seem like something that is relatively simple to automate and is a valid question. It's sort of like me falling asleep watching Netflix and it popping up after a couple hours and go, hey, are you still watching or not? It's like, or actually I use a similar logic when it comes to purging stuff from the house. Like, we move stuff to the garage. After like a year, I'm like, well, if nobody's even opened this box, we obviously don't need whatever is in it. Let's get rid of it. It's similar logic of saying, hey, I've given you these credentials, and if you need them to do your job effectively, then so be it. That's great. That's fine. However, I have this automated system in place that says you're not even actively using these, so why are they on?
Exactly. It's funny you mentioned the box analogy. I have the exact same closet management clothes philosophy, which is if there's something in my closet like a dress shirt that I haven't worn in a year, I say it doesn't belong to me anymore. And I get rid of it.
Seems fair.
Yeah, the tricky part, I think, is really automating that as much as possible, and then also giving users the confidence that if you take something away, it's easy for them to get it back. I think if you can really nail that, and that's about building trust with the end users, it's about kind of having that low touch education point with the end users themselves about, hey, it looks like you have access to these systems. Do you actually still need this? You haven't logged in 60 days. If you don't log in, we'll probably downgrade your license or take that access away, but it's going to be really easy for you to get it back. You can self-serve request it, and we'll grant it and provision it. I think it's about providing that timely context, and then again, just making it really easy for someone to get that access back if they need it.
Yeah. Well, and then I guess to kind of take that concept to, in a slightly different direction or a step further, is the idea of the just in time, or like, one of the things that was sort of new to me, someone introduced me to the concept last year. We were talking about how there was a trend of Russia aligned threat actors executing ransomware attacks on like the Friday before a holiday weekend. So like this Friday, as we go into Memorial Day weekend, knowing that nobody's going to be at work, or there's going to be a skeleton crew. Nobody's, there's fewer people paying attention. So that's a great time to execute an attack. And someone said, well, all these credentials should just be turned off. Like nobody, nobody's going to be at work. So why even allow the credentials to work? And I hadn't, prior to that, I hadn't really heard of that concept. I was like, oh, I didn't know it was a thing people do, where you just say, well, what if we just turned off all of the access except for like one, admin account for emergencies or whatever. But that's kind of the nuclear option. But even just in general, I think it's fair to have a system that says, hey, this is when Tony works. Like I don't need Tony's credentials to work really at 3 a.m. on Saturday. He's not going to be logging in then.
100%. And couldn't agree with you more on the idea of just in time. I mean, I totally empathize with the idea of like nuking everyone's credentials on a holiday weekend. Obviously the implementation detail matters a little bit. Like, how do you nuke the credentials? Are you resetting them? Do they need to re-enroll? Like, are you just suspending them? Like, what does that actually look like? But I think the philosophy of it is absolutely spot on, which is the idea that if you boil down kind of just even the concept of, hey, during a long holiday weekend, most people aren't going to need access. The fundamental first principle based ideas there are people shouldn't have access to things when they don't need it. They should be able to get access to different resources, applications, particularly privileged or sensitive resources and apps when they do need it. And that should be as low touch and low friction as possible. And so I think, while it's great to maybe do something in a one-off, I really think every company would benefit from a security standpoint of just operationalizing that at a program level. It's like, well, why just do this for the weekend? Why don't we just make this, much more of like a just-in-time program? How do we identify our critical infrastructure, applications, places where our customer data sits, and what are the controls and policies and procedures we want to have in place to actually secure that in much more of a real-time, just-in-time based access control pattern?
Yeah. One of the things, you and I discussed this briefly just before we started the podcast, but I was saying, if I'm starting a company from scratch, then I can pick and choose the applications that I'm going to use, and I can choose things that by default are designed to work together, et cetera. But over time, that's going to change. If you're going in and talking to an existing customer, they've already got an investment of, they've got security tools in place. They've got whatever, network management tools in place. They've got, all these things already exist. So, from ConductorOne's perspective or whatever, you have to be able to integrate with those. Like, you have to make it as easy for me as possible. So like, how does ConductorOne address that?
Yeah, that principle of sort of meeting customers where they are was a core founding principle and a common theme in how we make all of our product investments. So we really wanted to, and actually, if you take a step back for a second, the reason that was an important principle to us is that my co-founder and I have lived and breathed identity and lived in the identity world for many, many, many years. And it's just the recognition that actually identity and access control is extremely messy. Every company has a slightly different way of doing it. Certainly there are cloud native companies that were born in the last 5 years that are only in the cloud. They don't have an on-premise infrastructure or anything like that. But there's a lot of companies out there that don't just look like that. They might have on-prem Active Directory. They have LDAP powering their infrastructure access and authorizing access to servers. They might have multiple IDPs. They might have an IDP that they're using to power engineering access to infrastructure, and an IDP that they use for the rest of their workforce for SaaS applications. It's a very messy world, actually, and people have very good business reasons for the technical choices that they've made, and or they might just have historical reasons because they were started in 2010 or 2005 or whatever the case might be. And so I think you really, when you recognize that that is the way the world looks and works in reality, you make different technical and product decisions that kind of embrace that reality. And just as a very tactical example, and a little bit shameless self-promotion, but like one of the concepts that we have in ConductorOne is you can have multiple IDPs connected to ConductorOne, and we build a sort of a single sort of book of record around what all your canonical user identities are throughout those different IDPs and HR systems that might exist. That's a very different philosophical way of kind of building an access control product versus assuming you have a single IDP that's a single source of truth, and that your HR system is perfectly synced up to it, and kind of there's like a lot of assumptions that go into that different world. So I would say it starts at that philosophical level, from just how you build the product, and there's a lot of product decisions we've made on that. I think the other piece of it is at the integrations level. So we provide visibility into access and authorization and resources that your company has throughout all of your applications. We manage the workflows around access requests and reviews. But to do that, you have to connect to all these different environments, and those environments might be on-premise, they might be in cloud infrastructure, you might be managing access all through your IaaS IAM control plane, like AWS's IAM control plane. But in order to manage access to all those different technologies, you really need to bridge that protocol gap of given a control plane, how does that control plane work with all these different technologies? And so we created an open source ecosystem called Baton, where we've been open sourcing our integrations, really with the idea of evangelizing this protocol that's kind of an open IGA, privilege access management protocol. You could think of it as that, for provisioning access, deprovisioning access, getting visibility across all your different identities and resources and authorization and access rights within an application.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's off topic somewhat, but one of the kind of growing areas of security issues or concerns is in the API side, and so it goes back to the mantra that I've professed for many years of everything that makes your life easier also makes it easier for threat actors. So everything that helps you can be used against you, and so now we've got this massive ecosystem with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of APIs out there, which are all very useful and they do great things, but also theoretically could be used against you at some point. To some extent, I think, and again, different topic, but and you may not know, I know I don't know, but like it seems to me like it would be nice if there was more like standardization of like maybe every single thing doesn't need to have its own API. Maybe there's just some API that says, hey, this is just how we communicate with each other, and then you don't have to have 75 different APIs that do the same thing.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if you look at the analogy here with authentication, I think when the kind of cloud happened, so to speak, I know the cloud's been happening for like 20 years. Salesforce had the no software Ghostbusters logo back in like 2004 or something like that. But when cloud really became prolifically adopted, I would say starting in like early 2010, the SAML standard already existed. SAML had been around since, I don't even know, 1995 or something. It was used for like internal applications and federating users through internal apps. And so cloud really, I think, benefited from having that federation protocol standard where you could authenticate a user once in an IDP and then log them into some other application. Because the standard existed, that standard was pretty well baked and it worked. And so cloud apps could just implement SAML, and all of a sudden you could hook that up to your IDP, and it made it infinitely easier to adopt that additional technology. The challenge is no protocol exists for authorization. So there's no protocol out there that says, hey, here's how you should manage account lifecycle. Here's how you provision users. Here's how you grant a permission on a resource. Here's how you inspect all the different accounts and permission levels that they have within an application. And so in the absence of that, you can kind of do a closed source thing, which, some companies are trying to do that. We believe that at the end of the day, that your identity data and authorization data belongs to you, and it should be easily accessible. And that's why we created Baton, not just as an ecosystem to build our own integrations against and really make that plug and play there, but also as something that is open source. You can pull it off the shelf and use it to, let's say, like audit your AWS infrastructure for all the identities and permissions that users have in AWS.
Right. Well, and I will say that I appreciate the open source aspect of it, because I think that's where things start to get to sort of what I was referring to, which is, you could create some proprietary thing and then everyone else creates their own proprietary thing. But if you can create an open source, solution and have enough people jump on board that kind of grows to be the standard, like eventually it's like, all right, well, it seems like everyone's using this, let's just use that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's also standalone use case. There's obviously kind of connecting up workflows to those different applications, and the standard protocol sort of helps at that level. But there's also just standalone use cases that I think are interesting as well. So we found when we were early days doing a lot of customer discovery, every single company we would talk to auditing their infrastructure, and who had access to that infrastructure was like a common pain point, as you might imagine, because security teams they want to know, like, who has access to GitHub? Do we have orphaned accounts in GitHub? Did we properly offboard users from GitHub when they, left the company? Are people over permission? Like, those are hard problems. And what we found is that a lot of security engineering teams were solving the exact same problems using different variations of like hacky Python scripts, effectively, like pull that data out, get the data, munge it, do something with it, dump it into your SIM or generate an alert on it or look through a report or whatever the case might be. And so again, just from an open source standpoint, our hope is that by really making that easy and accessible, people can use technology that's a little bit more robust, maybe as middleware, to be able to solve those same pain points.
Is there a function of ConductorOne that is also able to do, say, sort of identity and access inventory for that? Because there's the you can't protect what you don't know about concept, and so the active management of this is all great, but also as a company, I would want something that's going to, on a regular basis, basically scan my entire ecosystem so that I can know, oh, hey, there are these rogue users out here or these rogue devices that you're not paying attention to.
Yeah, you can't protect what you can't see. That's exactly one of the use cases that a lot of our customers use our product for, is frankly just getting visibility into all the identities and access that exists within their environment and asking critical questions like, show me all the orphaned accounts in my environment, show me users who have active local accounts in different SaaS applications that have been terminated in the HR system. And so just being able to ask those questions is exceptionally challenging for security teams, where you may not even have the rights to be able to go in and kind of inspect those systems because they might be owned by, like maybe your HubSpot account is owned by the sales team, the sales ops team, or something like that. And so just getting that visibility ends up being a very non-human scale problem for an organization once they become, let's say, like 150 people. You don't even know who all the people are who should have access. You may not, the left hand doesn't know what the right is. You're in a remote centric culture. You don't know if people have been, new people have been onboarded, let go, what the case is there. And so kind of combobulating all of that data and providing a central pane of glass where you can look at all the identities and applications and resources and permissions across your environment is exceptionally valuable. And customers, they've been loving that part of ConductorOne.
Well, and I imagine that sort of the initial, hey, we've installed this, let's take a look, is eye-opening for most customers. Like I can't think of a scenario where that initial search wouldn't generate something that would make someone go, "Oh crap."
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Most organizations have something out there where it's like, "Hey, why does that guy we fired 3 years ago still have an account on this domain controller?"
Exactly, and why is that? And why is that account active? That's right. I mean, it is. It's exactly that. It's super eye-opening. Again, sort of companies love that part of our POC and trial experiences, connecting it up to a few systems and being able to ask some pretty critical security-oriented questions like that, being a little bit blown away by the results.
Right. And because there have been well-known. The one that stands out is just the Colonial Pipeline, being hit by, basically a zombie VPN account. So had someone done some sort of an assessment of the network and said, "Hey, why does this VPN account exist?" They could have avoided that attack.
Yeah, exactly. And it actually ties back. We talked a little bit earlier about sort of embracing the reality that identity is messy, and from like a multi-directory standpoint and being able to understand your HR status and your directory status, that ties into all this, right? Because if you actually understand who all the human users are in your workforce and all the contractors, then you can understand the accounts that are associated with those folks in the local SaaSes, and then drive the right remediation workflows from like an offboarding standpoint to make sure that you properly secured offboarded accounts as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think, and it plays into a broader issue that I've encountered a few times, which is just offboarding processes in general seem to be much less well defined than onboarding. Like onboarding, people have thought about, hey, when someone starts, we need to give them this, we need to walk them through this, they need to sign these forms, we need to get them set up with access, et cetera, et cetera. Offboarding, it's like, all right, well, did they turn in their laptop and we took away their key card. And I've been on the side of, from my department, on the kind of like being on like a content and marketing side, but just saying, hey, I need someone. There needs to be somewhere that where there's like a internal newsletter that goes out that says, oh, by the way, we let Bob go. Like I need to know that because then I'm trying to reach out to, hey, where'd Bob go? And they're like, well, he doesn't work here anymore. I'm like, oh, well, why didn't anyone tell me?
Yeah, 100%. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, even just like at the organizational level, right? Like when you onboard new users, of course, people always get the access they need because there's like a live human to make noise if they don't have it. So, so they're like asking the question like, hey, I need this thing. They're submitting IT help desk tickets, like the access levels are growing. When folks are offboarded, like you said, you may not even know. That may not be like a well-announced thing. That may not kind of trickle down to the respective system owners. No one's complaining that they need more access, so it's not really being like inspected necessarily. I've definitely met with several customers who, particularly in larger companies, it's with all the rifts that happened kind of towards the end of the year, beginning of the year, it's a board level discussion as to whether or not a lot of folks were properly offboarded and really verifying that and making sure that the access to the environment is properly secured. Because I think it is a very significant threat to have kind of orphaned accounts or non-offboarded accounts with access rights to potentially sensitive data and infrastructure.
Yeah, well, I mean, for sure, because it's. I mean, they're different. parts of the same problem, but it's like, it's one thing to say, you know, Tony only needs access when Tony needs access, and we should limit what I have access to control the blast radius. All of that makes great sense for me as an active user. That's one part of the problem to solve, and the other part is like these rogue, like orphaned zombie accounts out there, because ultimately the attacker, the threat actor just needs a way in. and oftentimes that way in is enough to, a creative attacker will find a way to navigate laterally through the network until they find your Achilles heel.
And it only takes one account. That's the other thing too, right? It only takes one account sometimes to get the access that you need. But I think also to your point about zero trust, I view it similarly, which is all of these problems around access control live on a spectrum, and it's kind of the same spectrum. It's like birthright access is related to just-in-time access, and zero standing privileges for critical infrastructure is related to how you properly offboard users. And the common theme is you need visibility across all your applications, you need to understand your identities, and you need to drive and automate workflows as much as possible to make sure that you're right-sizing permissions and privileges.
Yeah, because not to take anything away from John Kinderberg for coining the zero trust term or whatever way back when, but more recently I had a conversation with a CISO who kind of pushed back on the whole concept. He said, "Well, it's a misnomer from the get go." He's like, "There's always trust. There's no such thing as zero trust. You can't get anything done with zero trust. It's much more limited trust. It's I'm more scrutinizing of who I'm trusting, but in the end, you are still trusting something or someone. Otherwise, nothing would get done."
Yeah, absolutely. I actually remember early days zero trust. The other concern I would hear from CISOs is just the term, the phrase zero trust feels a little bit like a pejorative sometimes. So this was back before zero trust was like the new buzzword, where it's board level conversation, and people were kind of bought into it organizationally because everyone knew it. It was actually really hard to evangelize zero trust internally because it sounded naturally like you wanted to take things away from people. So it's just an interesting, I guess, point of security is sometimes, frankly, an evangelization problem, and it's like a hearts and minds and getting everyone bought into what you're trying to accomplish at the organizational level. And you need good names for these things. That's why I actually like least privilege a lot as a term, because it's like, yeah, of course we should be giving least privilege. Like, we shouldn't have people over privileged. Like, that's not a good thing.
Right. No, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's like I will stop short of touching the third rail on politics, but in general, it often comes to politics is often a marketing issue. It's not like who has the better idea; it's who can market their idea better, and oftentimes that comes down to what is the term you came up with to call your legislation. Because the name can make all the difference. It could be great legislation with a crappy name, or crappy legislation with a great name, and that will make a difference in how it resonates in the hearts and minds of voters, and
100%.
Or in this case, in the hearts and minds of users. It's like, if you call it one thing, people are like, "Oh, that sounds like a thing I want. We should do that." But if you just change the name, everyone goes, "Ooh, that sounds draconian," and like you're trying to control me. I don't want that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the talking points matter. It'd be like the difference of, is it access control or like access enablement? It's like one sounds a little bit like you're trying to control things. One sounds like you're trying to help me out. But that definitely matters when you're when you're looking at just how you change the culture internally, how you roll out solutions. It's a marketing problem.
That actually was a very good point, because we still do use we still say access control like that. We still use those terms, but I do feel like over the last 10, 15 years, security in general has evolved. It has matured within the business world to understand that we are here to facilitate productivity securely. We're not here to get in the way of it. We're not here to implement security for the sake of security. We're trying to enable you. We're trying to help you get your job done safely. So we should look at, well, maybe we should change some of these terms.
100%. I mean, I think there's other elements to that as well that have moved the needle. I think one is that we see, particularly in our customer base, a lot more collaboration and even convergence at times between IT and InfoSec and security engineering, where I think in some ways those are two sides to the same coin, right? Where security is really trying to create the right policies and guardrails and paved roads to make sure that the team has the tools and security and is able to adopt technology securely. IT was sometimes like the enforcement hammer of that. And so I think figuring out how those teams kind of work together and roll out tools that have great user experiences that customers love, I think is the mutual win there, where you can be both secure, make sure that you're able to adopt and move things quickly, or adopt in technology and move quickly. But you're doing it in a way that enables users to be productive and happy. And so I think the trade-off no longer really needs to exist, particularly when you sprinkle a lot of automation in the mix, and you sprinkle sort of the right layers of control to the right teams, being able to balance that. And that's one thing that we've really embraced, just with being able to automate ConductorOne from like a policy perspective, and configure it, from like an API driven standpoint, and but then also again, like automating the provisioning, deprovisioning processes, making it delightful from an end user experience standpoint.
Okay. Well, and like I say, ultimately it is definitely the goal. People have pushed back on two-factor, multi-factor, like all these things, because it's like, well, it's annoying. Now I got to do an extra thing. But it is a matter of finding that balance. It's like, on the one hand, security doesn't want to be the draconian, hey, you will do it our way because we said so. But on the other hand, we can't just rubber stamp everything and just be like, whatever. So it's like there is a middle ground where we say, okay, look, I don't want to make you do things you shouldn't have to do, but there are some things you have to do.
Yeah, 100%. I think the other thing that's a powerful tool there is, mixing in the right carrots and trade-offs if the team does do those things. So, if you do adopt device-aware access control or just-in-time access control, you don't have to do X, Y, Z. Kind of like framing that a little bit for the team sometimes around like what is the threat that we're trying to solve for, and there's different ways that we can solve that, and there's going to be this experience if you choose to do it this way, and there's maybe a little bit of a better experience if you choose to do it this way. I think that's a framing sometimes that security teams have used that we've seen successfully.
Okay. I don't have any other questions, but I will kind of wind down by simply asking if you have any closing thoughts, if there are anything else that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure we discuss before we wrap up.
No, I mean, I guess my parting thought is I'm just really excited to really help with this problem. I think everyone at our team at ConductorOne is really on this mission to secure workforce identity. We just fundamentally don't believe in the old trade-offs of productivity versus security. We think there's better ways to solve it, and we're excited to just be a part of that movement and make the world a more secure place and sort of secure the next generation of cloud forward, cloud adopting companies.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tony. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
All right, take care. I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.